what are your rights if your house floods? Is it still your house, or is it no longer in your ownership because it's under the
once
sea?
Something goes underwater, it's technically public property. So if your house is half underwater, do you get a discount on your council tax?
That was so funny.
Hello and welcome back to No Books on a Dead Planet, the podcast where we read books about the climate that you're scared to read, so you don't have to. And the hope is that at the end of the podcast, you might want to read the book anyway. Just tempting you, just saying. Today, we have a very special guest. We have Sanne Vliegenthart with us. Hello, Sanne.
Hello. Thank you for attempting to pronounce my last name.
I
always appreciate it. Pretty good.
In 13 years of friendship, I think I'm getting better.
Yes, but
Vliegenthart. There you go.
But the thing is, focus on that first name, and then once you got that right, it's good.
If you didn't know from the surname, Sanne is from what the author of this book has termed Kingdom of Fish.
True.
You are from what would otherwise be a kingdom of fish.
It would be a kingdom of fish if we hadn't done anything about it.
Yes, you have saved yourself from the kingdom of fish, but we'll see. Maybe it will be the kingdom of fish in the future. So, Sanne, would you like to just introduce yourself a little bit for anybody who is audacious enough to not know your work?
Yeah, definitely. So I go by Books and Quills on the internet and have done for a very long time. You can hear me talk about, as you might suspect, books on YouTube and TikTok and Instagram. I also am a freelancer in publishing, and we met through doing YouTube and working in publishing together. I've lived in London for about 10 years, and I love apocalyptic fiction.
I just like to think about the world ending. So I thought for this, I was like, well, this is an easy win. Sometimes I feel like I need to twist people's arms to come on, but I was like, Sanne will be there.
And I'm also the host of the End of the World Book Club podcast.
On any podcast platform anywhere, waiting for you once you finish this episode. So on the podcast, I like to either let the guest pick the book, or I give them some suggestions and then they pick from it, because I think the most important thing to do when you're starting with reading books about the climate is that you pick a book that you genuinely have an interest in, and there's a little spark there for you already. And I think as things continue to develop, there are more and more climate books on the market. So I really think that there are starting to be enough books where you can really tailor your reading experience towards your own special interests. So, Sanne, I know that you already own this book. The book that we are reading this time is The Water Will Come by Jeff Goodell.
Good question.
He's quite good, so I think I'd like to call him Goodell. You picked this book, and I would love to hear why. I mean, you are into the apocalypse, and if you haven't seen the front cover, the cover is just a picture of some very, very tall buildings being submerged by water.
That cover is incredible.
Incredibly terrifying.
Love it, yes. And that's kind of the vibe of the book, I would say.
Okay.
I hadn't heard of this book before, but then my dear friend and flatmate read it, I think, and I saw the cover and I thought, ooh, that is of interest. And I can read you the dedication of the book, the personal dedication that's written in it. It says, "Dear Sanne, for your 30th birthday, you asked for a book about how we're all going to die and it will be our fault. I'm happy to oblige. Congratulations on the end of the world. Happy 30th birthday."
A movie that's like a kind of millennial gift for our time.
And appropriately, I also asked for it secondhand, so it's a secondhand copy. I think it's an American edition. It's quite floppy.
They do like the long grain in America. You've got the floppy bendable books. Much more of a flexible reader over there, I think. We're much more stiff. I was aware of this book, so when you mentioned it, I was like,
oh, interesting.
It's the underwater book.
Yep.
And actually, this is a really great example of the books that I am scared to read about the climate. Okay. Even though I've delved into the world of climate books because of this podcast, and only through this podcast and setting up my own artificial level of like social implication, like feeling like I have a deadline, feeling that people are expecting it of me, and that's actually how I motivate myself to read. But I would say this is on my list of books that I was very terrified to read, but I was like, I'm glad that I'm doing it with you. I would only do it, I think this is a book that I would only buddy read. Okay. I wouldn't want to know all this information on my own and have nowhere to talk about it at the end of it.
So I was coming straight out of The Uninhabitable Earth,
which I haven't finished, famously, because it's another book that I read the first 33% of it, and I was like, that's enough for me for now.
Yeah, so I would say this is a lighter version of that, in a way, in a sort of can you deal with it way, probably just because it's tackling one topic instead of all of them.
Yeah, it's much more kind of, but although I would also say that's kind of like saying the 9th circle of hell is actually a little bit more mild than the 10th circle of hell, not quite as hot. I think it's interesting that was your choice. Unsurprising. Interesting, but unsurprising.
And I thought it'd be relevant, you know.
And I think that one question I always like to ask people on this podcast is like, how comfortable do you feel, honestly, about having conversations about the climate? Because this is a book that you willingly asked for. You were like, I saw that cover and I want that on my shelves, which is a slightly different approach than I have to it. And I'd love to hear, how you feel about conversations about the climate.
I'm the kind of person that read plague books during COVID, at the height of COVID. So I am very happy to talk about it all. I feel like I talk about it with my partner quite a lot. I talk about it with friends a lot. I have no issues reading books about the topic. I don't know if it's because I am Dutch and we're quite like down to earth, practical people, or if it's just my own personality. I would rather know and be informed and know what's going on, because to me that's less scary than not knowing.
So you're more of a tell it to me straight doc
yes
kind of person.
Yeah,
whereas
much.
I'm like, ooh, maybe give me some medicine first, ease me into it, sign me up with a therapist, and then maybe tell me a little bit of the truth.
I'm very much like, what are we dealing with? Like, how bad is it really? I want to know.
I'm interested in that, like that guess that maybe it is also a little bit of like a cultural Dutch thing. Do you think that's also connected to the fact that, and I've now learnt from this book, that 70% of the Netherlands is below sea level?
My parents' house, I believe, is 4 meters below sea level, and it is a 20-minute walk from the coast. So
you can't see this in audio form, but I am pulling the flesh of my skin down off my face and towards the floor. That is very terrifying.
We went to a museum exhibit and you could put in your postcode and it would be like, it was about, you know, the future and green energy. And it was like, how far are you below seawater? And it was not good. So
do you feel like you're also more comfortable talking about it because that's something that people already talk about?
Well, the thing is, do people talk about it?
Well, you tell me. You're there. I haven't been there.
It feels like we've got it covered.
Okay.
Up to a point. They recently, in my town, in the last few years, they upped the dunes. They redid the whole coast area to future-proof it to a certain degree. I don't know to what degree. But I feel like reading this book, I was definitely looking out for mentions of Dutch people. And there's
boy, were there quite every time they were like, so we've pulled in an expert, Dutch architect, blah blah blah, Dutch science person, Dutch engineer. It was peppered with Dutch people.
This is a quote from the book. Where there is a city at risk of flooding, you'll likely find a Dutch engineer offering, or just as often, selling a solution. When you watch the news, you'd be like, oh, this horrible thing has happened somewhere, and you kind of know that like a Dutch engineering team is going to go out there and
is already on the
plane. Which is like a weird pride. It's like, oh no, something horrible happened. But it is kind of assumed at this point. And so I think it's something that Dutch people are probably quite proud of. It's like, we've got this knowledge out of necessity. But yeah, it's an interesting one.
Yeah. I think as an overview of the book in general, actually, what's the subtitle? You've got the cover here.
Tell us. Rising Seas, Sinking Cities, and the Remaking of the Civilized World.
If I was going to summarise what the book was about, I actually read the digital version, so I actually am now having the realisation that I never read the blurb. I just went, because you told me what it was called, and I downloaded it onto my Kindle and never read the blurb. How I would summarise it blind was that I would say that it's a book that goes through a lot of the logistical problems people are currently having with seawater rise levels and what we could be facing in the future. Interrogating what some of the solutions are with loads of like different anecdotes from different experts, and at the end coming to a bit of a soupy conclusion that's like, look, it could go either way. This is an opportunity, or it could be like the shittest thing to ever happen. Who can say?
It feels like a very on the ground, like he's a journalist, he's obviously very involved in the topic, and he went to loads of locations, and that's what I really loved about the book. It's like, oh, now he's in Alaska, now he's talking to Obama,
now he's in Nigeria,
now he's talking to some real estate owner in Miami who's denying climate change. Like, I really liked that it wasn't just him like on a, you know, sitting on his chair at home, sitting at his desk typing it out. It felt like he was quite involved in the topic and really cared about it, which is, sometimes it feels more, some people write a climate book because they've like kind of picked it up as casual interest, I think. And this feels very involved, which I liked.
Yeah, I definitely feel like it was a very thorough book for those who are already interested in engineering or stats. I would really recommend. For me, it was a bit of both. I liked, again, I think it's more my interest is that I liked the kind of more anthropological stuff about like Noah. They talk a lot about like the origins of the Noah story and how it probably wasn't originated in the Bible. It was probably originated from some pseudo rumors / mythology around like a very specific flood that did happen. So I find all the kind of psychology, especially some of his speculations of the psychology of rich people around it was really, really interesting. But for me, it was very data heavy. And what I wish, and this is more about me as a reader, is that I wish I had read it over a longer period of time so I could let those stats sink in, Google things a little bit, come back to the next chapter. Whereas because I read it all in one, I was like, this is a lot of numbers, Jeff. It's a lot of numbers.
See, coming out of The Uninhabitable Earth, which I read before, this feels way more conversational. Still has a lot of numbers, but less. And also, this I read physically, which I would recommend, I think, reading physically rather than audio, because Uninhabitable Earth I read by listening to it, and then as soon as you get any numbers, it just starts floating through your head. So I really like this. Has like pictures in it. Did your ebook have pictures in it? Very nice. To me this felt more like watching a documentary, maybe, which is why I was okay to have like some stats and things thrown at me. I was just so fascinated by, like you're saying, the rich people. The sort of, he meets two kinds of people. He meets the scientists who are basically going, we know what's wrong. We know how to fix it. Probably. Please listen to us. And then he just meets a ton of people who are like, we're rich. Whatever. It's fine. It will solve itself. Science will solve it.
I believe in humanity.
Not listening to any of the scientists that are saying we've got a problem.
Yeah, it's concerning. And I think that the book did a really good job of like walking around the topic of sea level rise and kind of like looking at it from all angles. And I think this is really good. I don't feel like he had a really strong agenda that was like, oh, this is what you should do at the end.
Although it does say in the beginning, if you don't believe in climate change, this is not the book for you. Like, I'm not going to try and like convince
Although I feel like that's
not
having I think believing in climate change isn't like an opinion.
Yeah.
So I'm like, taking into account the science and the fact that he believes in climate change, beyond that, I don't think he had like a very strong like journalistic voice, which I actually think was quite helpful if you're reading this book, to just try and educate yourself more about the topic in general, rather than it causing, I don't know,
and he lets lots of people speak, which is nice.
Like, it's a lot of direct quotes and a lot of and especially when he interviews Obama, which I'd like to unpack at some point. But I don't know at what point.
I loved to just like, we're now talking to Obama. He's doing a one-on-one interview with Obama.
He had an hour with Obama.
Yeah,
how big?
And Obama gave him more time. He's like, we'll keep talking about this topic. I thought that was fascinating.
And that he was willing to just be like, no holds barred, let's talk about climate change for an hour. And I'm like, cool. This book was written in, I think it was probably 4, 5, 6 years ago.
I think it's 2017.
Trump was in power.
Which quite colours this book. It's very of its time. And I'm curious if there will be an updated version and what that would be like, because so much of it is like, oh man, Trump just got in power, let's see what this does. And I found that quite fascinating.
And the interview with Obama is when he's in his like very last term and he kind of knows that it's over, but Trump is campaigning, but everyone's not taking him seriously yet. So it's interesting to have an interview with Obama before he knows what the threats are, and that they might actually, like the US might actually back out of the Paris Agreement, and other fun historical moments that we in the present day remember vividly.
And also Obama predicts COVID.
Yes, he does. He says
my biggest fear is a worldwide pandemic.
We're due one. Maybe it'll be SARS. Maybe bird flu. But a lot of experts are saying that, so I kind of I can see why. I think he might not be like the
obviously
only
he'd
canary.
been told, what we should be worried about, and that was one of them.
Yeah. How did you feel about the Obama interview in general? Do you want to go into it now? I thought that it was worrying, although it sounds also like him. It was very much within the remit of what I understand he does as a politician. He's very pragmatic, but I think it's also a good learning curve for us when we think about whether politicians are doing their job, because their job is dependent on the masses agreeing with them.
There's more bits about politicians in the sort of military chapter as well, where they talk about like how the military is going to deal with climate change. And yeah, it feels like the conclusion he just, you know, the author comes to is like, or you come to as you listen to the interviews, is like whether politicians believe in climate change or are actively fighting against it. They know that the moment they say that, they lose half the people. And so they have to find other reasons or other ways to discuss it and convince people, even if they want to say, you know, we're in dire trouble, climate change is happening, we need to do something. It seems like they can't say it out loud in that way, and they kind of know they can't, which I found interesting, which I'm not, I mean, am I against it? I don't know. To me, I'm like, whatever gets stuff done, I guess. But does it get stuff done?
But that's what's confusing about the role of a politician in our lives. It's because we often think of them influencing us.
Yeah.
And actually they're saying, whether it's true or not, they're saying, actually, I don't have the power to influence people's opinions. What I need to do is use their opinions to back specific things that I believe in.
Yeah.
At their own pace and in their own time. And Jeff is talking to Obama and he's like, yeah, but that doesn't really work with climate change, does it? Because we don't really have any time. And Obama's answer to my memory was kind of like, well, it's either that or do nothing. So eat it.
Or I'm
very
like,
crude summary of Obama's words.
Yeah.
And he's like, if I don't do it at this pace, I won't be here at all.
Yeah.
Somebody else will be making the decisions. And they might make worse ones.
And it's this, again, the same with that military chapter. They're like, well, we needed new docks because the sea levels are rising. But if we say we need new docks for this military base because of sea levels, any politician that is on the sort of camp of, well, we can't talk about climate change, will go, no, cross that out, we don't need that. If they just go, we need new docks, then it gets signed off and they just build them higher and they just don't say anything about it.
Yeah.
That's like, wow, they're playing the game. They know.
Yeah.
But they have, you know, there's just certain things that are almost like taboo because you know one half is immediately going to go, no. Even if it's a good idea, no, because that confirms climate change.
Yeah, something that they don't want.
Because that doesn't work. And it felt like a lot of the book is about all the people that benefit from the idea that climate change isn't real, even though they probably believe it, but they can't admit it because if they do, their whole industry is going down. And they know their whole industry is going down and they can't keep making the money that they're making. And that's quite depressing.
And I think it also might come from a bit of I don't want to blame it all on the boomers, but a slightly, I hope, becoming extinct attitude to careers where people are so married to their career and their discipline and their industry that they would rather not sink that ship and they'd rather just die.
Yes.
Or they'd like happily let their children die.
That's the other thing. Half of them are going, I won't be there for that. That's in 40 years. I'm like, your kids will be alive in 40 years. What are you?
Yeah,
what are you talking about?
It's very. I couldn't believe how many people he interviewed that just literally just said it.
Yeah.
I was like, no, I thought that's something that you would think and not say aloud. But they're like, no, put me on the record. Like, go for it.
Does not make you feel hopeful about a large demographic of people.
Yes, definitely. And it made me think a lot about how, I don't know, I feel like all of the action is necessary. So I'm not pitting one bit of action against another. But when we think about us civilians, just people like, what have I got? I've got a podcasting mic and I've got a vote, and that's literally probably about it.
Wow.
And I feel like I do want to encourage people to be like, talk to your MP, talk to your politicians, vote. Excellent. Do all that. But also I've realised from this book that politicians also need the social license to do it. So they might agree with you. The letters that I'm writing, they might be like, I would also write that letter in your position, but I can't do anything because of it. So it's also important to turn around and talk to the people around you.
Yeah.
Because without that, it doesn't matter if the politicians agree with us. Aha! So it's kind of like a pebble dash effect almost, where I'm like, yeah, we do need to talk to the people in power.
Yeah.
But if we don't simultaneously talk to the people around us, the people in power won't be allowed to do anything, because that's unfortunately how democracy works. And I've said unfortunately, and I regret saying unfortunately. That's fortunately how democracy works, because dictatorships aren't my fave either. But it does make me feel like there are limits to what politicians can do, and that's scary.
The psychological part of it is so weird. The sort of humans, and I think he mentions it in the book as well, that humans can't deal with change. They can't process it until they can see it. And because I mean, you can see floods happening, but you're like, oh, it's just a flood. It's a one-off flood. If you could see the level rising with your own eyes, eventually you're going to go, oh, it's real. But I think people are so good at just telling themselves, like, oh, that's a problem for later. Oh, is it really happening? I don't know. It's like that. I don't know where that comes from in the human psychology, but I feel like every climate change book I read mentions this at some point.
The phenomenon of being able to see.
It is just unfortunate that people are better equipped to deal with like a huge change that happens all at once. They're like, okay, you know, let's do it. But if it's slowly happening, even though you have a better chance of working against it, don't do anything.
And I think it's kind of encouraging, because I feel, I think the phrase that he used in one part that stuck with me was, he said that the only X factor in the equation, like the only like part of the equation that we can't predict, is human psychology.
Yeah.
That's the only part that like nobody, when you're asking for like, how many years do we have? How long will this take? How bad will it be? He's like, nobody can truly give the answer to that question, because the X factor is us.
Yeah.
And I was like, sinister, but also hopeful, because that is something that I do actually feel like I could start to understand how to change. Whereas like physics, I can't start there.
Yeah.
We can't change physics. That's not happening. I've made peace with it. And there's actually a quote that I really liked when he was talking about this idea of like, a lot of people think about ocean sea level rise as being able to be solved by barriers and engineering and stuff like that. And he said, wherever you build a wall, there's always a risk that Mother Nature won't accept your design specifications. And I like that as well, where it's like, I feel like we've been presented ocean guards as like a solution, and it sounds like,
I feel like he gives about 7 different examples of like, in Venice they're doing this project that costs this many billions, and in New York they're gonna just, half of Manhattan is gonna have a wall around it. Well, never heard of that before. It's gonna cost this much, and then every time he explains it, it's like, oh, but it kind of only works for like a little bit, and only for this much water, and if this goes wrong, or if this gets slightly delayed, like all of it is not even, from the beginning, it doesn't seem like it's going to be that great. They all seem a little like, maybe it'll help for a bit. Like nothing seems like none of those like dams or walls seems like they're going to be, it's like, it's just delaying the inevitable.
He described I think they call it the U wall, the kind of the U bend. That's a toilet. It's the kind of hoop that they're talking about, like building around Manhattan.
Oh, it's the big U.
The big U. And I'm the big me. The big U, which I think they maybe need to workshop the branding, but maybe that's not their top priority right now. But the big U is going to be built around Manhattan, and well, apparently it's one of the things they're talking about. And something that's scary about that is that he's like, okay, that sounds really good in a news article, but actually, if you know anything about walls, is that the water's going to go somewhere. So if you build a wall around Manhattan, the sea levels will rise elsewhere, because where's the water going to go? It's going to rise higher elsewhere, and also it can get around the sides. Yeah. So actually, there's some moral implications of like where the wall stops.
Yeah, the rich people get a wall, and then everyone else just has to deal with the consequences.
Yeah, and they're prioritizing Wall Street. Classic.
Oh man, that sentence. They talk about it for a few pages and then finally goes, oh, actually, it is placed specifically to protect Wall Street and to protect the economy. I was like, right.
And he did give a few paragraphs, like not justifying it in a moral sense, but explaining it and being like, well, that is the epicenter of like where our economy stems from. So if it goes under, the whole of the US will be at risk. And I'm like, from a very basic tertiary perspective, I'm like, yeah, I get that, but also, isn't it online? Like, I don't want to be like a dick, but I'm like, sorry, but isn't Wall Street kind of something that is kind of in the digital, like, can't you just move?
But all of it relies on people having faith in it. And if it's underwater, everything's going to tank, because people will be like, oh, what's happened? Even if that doesn't make sense. Yeah. Because it all just relies on
the symbolism.
Yeah.
So they wouldn't even just pick a different street that's a little bit higher up. Like, what? You could call it Wall Street. We've invented streets.
Headlines. Wall Street is changing. Everything's going down.
I feel like it's all like imaginary stuff that we've invented. And I'm like, okay, can we not just move them down?
The whole world is hanging together from like shoestrings.
Yeah. And it's really interesting. And again, like an exercise in psychology. Was it the book that you were expecting? Do you feel like when you've had this book on your shelf for ages, so you must have had some kind of like ghostly, pensive perspective of like what you thought you were about to read?
It went to, well, it was more dated than I thought it was going to be, which is
because you left it on your shelf for
so
long.
I know, I should have read it well, maybe even then. I've had it since 2019, so it would have felt a little bit more relevant maybe at the time. it went to more places than I thought it was going to go. It was still quite America-centered.
Yes.
But I loved the chapter on island nations. I thought that was interesting. Sometimes when you read a climate book, I feel like it's going to tell me stuff I already know with like little bits of extra that maybe is, you know, a different perspective. This taught me loads about very specific issues I didn't know were issues, about specific countries and people and strategies. I thought I had like little interesting nuggets in every chapter, and so I really liked that. I did kind of feel like it was going to fizzle a little bit in the end, and it did. It kind of... I think the rest of the book is more interesting than the end. There's not really a solution. There's not really, you know, anything. But, I don't know, it gave me a really different way of looking at this issue where before all I knew was the water will rise and it will be a problem. That's kind of where I was at. Yeah. And so I found it interesting, especially when he talked about that what we need is time. Like, we can retreat from the coast. Obviously, we need to, you know, stop CO2 emissions, etc., and, you know, stop it altogether. But... what we realistically need is more time to keep retreating, building up, that kind of thing, just to keep people safe realistically. But yeah, I was very intrigued about how he went into stories about Australia and myths that there were that go back, what is it, like hundreds, thousands of years, about people living with rising water. And I don't know, it took some unexpected twists and turns, which I really appreciated. Yeah. And how about you?
I really liked, like I said, I just think that I struggled to follow some of it. I don't know why, or I don't know if it's just because I didn't care about the mechanisms of how it was being done. But I struggled to follow some of it. But in general, I did think it was really useful. I think there was also like a bit of hope in every chapter, and the way he was kind of like, look, here's the thing. We all came from the ocean. We all had gills at one point.
And now it's coming for us.
And now it's coming for us. But also there was a point where it was completely acceptable to keep moving. We have this like fetishization with staying still in one place that that's not necessary for survival. So the idea that we have to stay in one place and we have like an emotional tie to a place is important, but it's not necessary.
Yeah.
So that was interesting. And I think also the fact that actually we romanticize living by the sea, holidaying by the sea, being by the sea, and actually in a very ancient, very real way, the beach was a very scary place to be.
Oh, I love that bit as well.
We should be scared of the beach.
Yeah, it's
what's
like
going on?
People that lived near the beach knew that the beach was dangerous and the sea was dangerous, so stay away. And then the rich tourists would come and be like, I need to bathe in the ocean. And then they started building up like Brighton and stuff like that. I found that fascinating. And also what it keeps coming back to as well is just people don't want to move away. They will literally, there's a whole bit about what are your rights if your house floods? Is it still your house or is it no longer in your ownership because it's under the
once
sea?
Something goes underwater, it's technically public property. So if your house is half underwater, do you get a discount on your council tax?
That was so funny. And I'm like, real Miami problems. That's good. That's happening right now. But yeah, there's so many communities where he went to interview people where they know it's going down. And sometimes the government offers to buy out and some people go and some people are like, no, I'm staying. Because there's a town somewhere in the UK as well that I think is like, you know, at risk of going. Yeah. And so many people just saying, no, it makes sense. This is where I live. I'm going to stay here. And then the question is, they can stay there until they die and then the water will come later, or will the water come in their lifetime? Yeah. It's like, how do you decide how long you can stay for if you don't know what the predictions are? But yeah, so many communities, for, you know, reasons I can understand, don't want to move, but yeah, the water will come, as the title says.
He's saying, Jeff knows. Yeah. And I think it's also helped me interrogate like my relationship to land, because I feel like, and this is mainly probably because of my own like experiences, privileges, upbringings, but I just can't imagine ever being attached to a piece of land that was trying to kill me. Like, so much that I'd rather die. Like, you know, I think that I'd feel differently if somebody was trying to take something that I saw as collectively my land or our land. I'd probably defend it because I wouldn't want them to have it. That's not fair. And that's how everybody, and understandably, feels throughout history. But if the land is actively trying to eject me, that's a really interesting conundrum. I'm like, you love the land so much that if it's literally like, I am going to sink you and drown you, you're
that
like,
explain the whole of the Netherlands.
Well, exactly.
You know, I think people just want to believe, whether it's true or not, that it'll be fine. It's fine. It's been fine so far. What's to say it won't be fine?
How do you feel about it when you think about the Netherlands? Or is that why you're not going home? That's okay. Stay here, please. I like you being here.
Being at my parents' house doesn't feel like it's about to flood. Feels fine. Yeah. Feels absolutely fine. The ocean's a while away. Mm-hmm. There's some dunes. It feels fine. I can see why people even that live at the coast there are like, what's the problem? We'll know when it's going to be a problem.
There'll be warning, yeah.
That's obviously very often not how it goes. Also, the Netherlands is a country that doesn't have very extreme weather, so you don't feel like, it's going to be a huge flood again soon. I mean, there was a huge flood in the 60s in the Netherlands where lots of dikes broke, and that was they talk about it in the book as well. That was the moment that they started taking it really, really seriously and thought, okay, this was a huge disaster. We can't have this again. But I can also see why, if half of your country is at flood risk, but so far it's been fine. Do you move?
Yeah, do you upload your, uproot your whole life for that? I was thinking, actually, when I was reading this book, a really vivid memory I have, and I know that you have met him and know him as well, but my first ever boss in publishing, my first ever job, when I finally quit that job to go to a new job, he, instead of being like, please stay, or good luck, I'm glad you're leaving, he just kind of led me to the table silently. This is the end of the day when everybody else had gone home. Silently led me to the big table in the middle of the office and unfolded a ordnance survey map. And he said, Leena, you're doing so well. One day you're going to make enough money to buy a house. And when you do, what I need you to do is look at this ordnance survey map, because some of London will be underwater, and I think you should be investing in real estate that's above that level. And I was like, that was his priority when he was, and this must have been 7-8 years ago.
Yeah.
And he's an eccentric. You met him,
no.
But it doesn't surprise me at all. And he was like, and that is why I live in this area. And he pointed to it, and I was like, okay.
I mean, after all the, there was so much rain and floodings in London as well, and people in basement apartments. Yeah. Flat can just get flooded, no warning, after a big rainstorm. So it's something to think about. But also, some people will have to live there. Yeah. And that's the other thing. I think so much of the book is just talking about so many people don't have the option to move away.
Somebody's whole country, it's not funny. It's
and then who's responsible? And they talked so much about the responsibility of the countries that are producing all the CO2 and that are just, consuming and producing and whatever. What happens? Are they personally held responsible for what happens to other countries? Do they have to pay? Do they take in climate refugees? How does that play out? And there don't seem to be any rules or decisions. Maybe it's changed since this book was written. I don't know how much has been updated since then, but that's so interesting to think about as well. And who deserves to have their own industrial revolution and build up their country. You can't do it anymore now, but the other countries got to do it 100 years ago.
But they're also not going to share the money with you, so that's cool. Enjoy. Yeah. And I think as well, it's I found the focus on Miami was interesting, and I get why he did it, because it's symbolically a very interesting.
Yes,
it's very different from New York. It's very different from anywhere else. A lot of people just accept that it's the next Atlantis. Which again, it was a phrase that I was like, what the fuck is happening?
There's a great meme that is I don't know if it's an official meme, but it's people saying, when that time comes, I'll just sell my house. And then he goes, to whom? Aquaman? It's
that when you sell your house, somebody has to want to buy it. Do you understand? So yeah, I think it's interesting, thinking about the people from the US who are featured in the Miami sections. And I wonder how people who live in island nations would feel about hearing about that, because they're sorry, so you legally can move elsewhere in your own country, and you have the option and you have the money, and you still won't. Yeah. When people who are living in island nations can't move anywhere else. That's literally where they live. That's their passport. That's their life. They don't have an option. And to hear people in Miami be like, I just don't really like the next town over.
But we're going to build a few new flats here that will probably not be here for very long.
Yeah.
But you get the money. Oh my God, the property tax. I learned so much about Miami property tax and Florida property tax, about how that is how the state makes its money. And so it's property is so involved in how that whole state runs. It's at the core of it, which I hadn't realized before.
And so so if you discharge all of those houses that are at flood risk, then they will lose.
They have no money to run the state.
Yeah. It does involve, again, it's just another reminder that it does involve system change as well, and everything is going to have to change. I felt hopeful in that this book allowed me to like pseudo meet more experts than I thought were working on it. I was like, okay, some people are really clever. They're already like, they've thought about how they're going to do this. That's reassuring. But also I think hearing the Miami people didn't give me great hope, because I don't think I am one of those British people who's like, we're not like those Americans. I'm like, yeah, we're totally like those. Like, if there was like a British Atlantis, there would 100% be British people who were like, I'm not leaving. This is where I live. So it doesn't restore any faith for me.
I found, besides hearing certain people speak, that you think, well, you're just in denial, or you're actively pretending like you're in denial so you can keep making money. Besides that, I did find it quite hopeful.
Okay, good.
Just because he does keep saying throughout the book, like, if we can just lower our CO2 emissions so it doesn't get to a point where it becomes so unpredictable that the water's going to rise, so like it's going to get to that tipping point everyone always talks about. If we can just keep it under that, we will have to move lots of people, but that's doable. We can slowly do that over time, but we need to slow down. And so it does seem like throughout the book he's like, we've got to slow down the carbon emissions and we got to make some plans to move, but that will be okay. If it gets worse than that, and if we keep, just going at the pace that we're going at, it's not going to be okay. And so I found that a helpful sort of mantra that he kept going back to.
Yeah, totally. And I think also like the idea that we have to drive down emissions people make it sound really complicated and really stressful, and like it might not be worth it, and politicians do that a lot, and they're like, it's just going to be such an effort. And then you hear experts talking through all the different ways that we could not do that and instead build flood defences, and then it starts to feel like actually reducing our emissions is the easier option.
Oh my god, and maybe cheaper.
And maybe cheaper.
Yeah.
So it kind of makes you feel like
build a $5 billion wall than put $5 billion into reducing emissions.
Yeah, and it's also like quite, if we are able to visualize it and see the visual implications of it, then I think it's a better motivator, honestly, for me to be like, yeah, I am going to go to war with the meat industry, because I don't think eating meat is this good that we have to watch a whole island nation go underwater for it. Like, there are very visual implications of doing stuff that I'm like, right, okay, I see, sir. And I think in some ways it's kind of like a good bit of like medicine, a little bit of Doc Leaf on the sting of like, I think you can't have a car, or I think you need to share your car with the other people on your street. But remember, it would be harder to try and build a whole fucking wall around your country and keep the water out. That would be harder.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a spoonful of sugar that helps the medicine go down. I think that's maybe how I would summarize it.
Like I said in the beginning, I like being informed. I'm glad I know all the stuff that's in here, for better or for worse. I'm glad I know it.
And I appreciate you for that. I think it's nice to be around that energy, because it doesn't naturally occur in my body. So like, I'm hoping that it's going to come through osmosis into me.
Is it going to cause some sleepless nights, do you think?
Maybe. I mean, I think flooding is one of the things I worry about, but I think that there's so much to worry about. My subconscious might forget about this one. I think also like it's interesting, early on in our friendship we were talking about like end of the world scenarios, because it comes up a lot. And I remember you saying like, because I was like, I read that book about the world ending and it scared me so much I had to stop reading, and you were like, I just kept reading, and I was like, how do you just keep reading that kind of book? And you were like, well, because I think that if that actually does happen, I'll just take a pill. I'm not going to be around for it. I'm not going to actually fight the zombies.
I mean, a lot of that was about zombie apocalypse. Okay, zombies, not,
it was specifically zombies.
Not the water levels rising, but yeah.
I understand why you wouldn't be interested in fighting a zombie, but I feel like stressed when I read zombie stuff, because I'm like, well, I've got to start taking notes, because I will be fighting the zombies, and what if I don't do what these...
At that point, I'm like, humanity is
it feels
over,
real
it's
to
fine.
me. Maybe it's just a good fiction writing, but I'm like, well, I feel like this is going to happen to me, so I need to prepare. And you're like, well, I'd never deal with that. So the pragmatism is almost inspirational, if a little sinister. But I love it. Who would you recommend this book to? Would it be everyone? Would it be anyone? Would it be somebody at the beginning of their climate reading journey? Would it be somebody who's like deep, like balls deep in it already?
I think even if you know quite a lot about it, you could still get something from this. I think there will be, even if you know the stats, you might not know the personal stories, or the other way around. I think because it touches so many topics, I'm guessing that most people won't have read about all of those topics. I think it'll be interesting. I mean, obviously it is on the higher stress level So if you are actively already in huge climate anxiety, maybe don't read this one. Although, I don't know, again, like I say, it depends on your personality. I find it helpful to know where we're at. And if you want something that's more like storytelling rather than lots of stats, then maybe this isn't for you either. But personally, I thought it was conversational enough that hopefully even if you don't read, you know, lots of scientific papers and stuff, you can still read it.
Yeah, it definitely wasn't an academic book. Definitely.
And it also goes from topic to topic fast enough that there was a bit about glaciers and I was like, yeah. Glacier, fine. Next chapter, please. But then it does, it does some history, it does some folklore, it does there's a nice mix of
definitely.
it.
Yeah, I think I'd say that too. And I think, I definitely wouldn't set this as the first climate book. And I also think if you're somebody who's just looking to take action, this is big picture thinking. This is not something that, we should know about it, so we can't be lied to about it. And definitely after reading it, if somebody's just like, we'll just build a dam, I'm going to be like, no, I'm not very damn sure about that. That's not so I think that it's more of like a preventative for being lied to. And like I said, I think it's more of a reminder that actually the best and easiest and most exciting thing is to just reduce emissions. There isn't a way, we can't technology ourselves out of this.
Because it is easy with lots of, hearing lots of different people and lots of different conversations to get a little bit taken away from the what does actually help? What do we actually need to do? And what is impossible? And I feel like this book does make me feel like it is possible just because you know that people are working on it. This is what the majority of people that work in this field are saying. It's good to kind of know, we do kind of know what needs to be done. And that's helpful to get a reminder for as well.
It's the will rather than the means that we're missing. So thank you for reading it with me.
I really enjoyed it.
I hand on heart would not have read it if
you hadn't
prodded me. So I'd actually, if you're going to read this book, I would also recommend Buddy reading it if you're more my personality rather than Sanne. A Buddy read is recommended.
Find your local Dutch person and then read it with them.
And give it some straight talking Dutch people to be like, look, it's just the way it is. Keep reading. Turn the page. I don't care if you're crying. Keep turning. Love it. Thank you so much for being on the podcast. Where can people find you if they'd like to find more of your voice?
They can find me on the End of the World Book Club podcast if you want to read some more apocalyptic fiction and non-fiction. And on the rest of the internet on YouTube, TikTok, Instagram at Books and Quills.
We're so active on TikTok. It's really, as another aspirational thing that I'm not going to...
I'm trying. I'm old, but I'm trying.
She's not scared of flooding and she's on TikTok. Wow. A hero for our times. And also, if you'd like a little tasty extra of me and Sanne in conversation, I've actually also been a guest on Sanne's podcast. We've been reading The Day of the Triffids together.
And we're talking about the apocalypse in the British countryside.
Ooh, deep, dark, dirty, and it's making me scared of my houseplants, if I'm honest. So definitely go and give that a listen as well.